On a quiet June night in 1980, St. Joseph, Missouri, lost its innocence. A librarian was found murdered inside her home. Fear spread like smoke, and the city demanded answers, demanded someone to blame. Police moved fast, too fast. Their spotlight fell on Sandra "Sandy" Hemme, a 20-year-old patient in a psychiatric hospital, heavily medicated, barely lucid. Detectives pressed until her confusion echoed their theory. Hesitation became a confession, stitched by suggestion, not truth. No fingerprints, no murder weapon, no witness. Nothing tied Sandy to the scene, except words wrung from a vulnerable mind. It didn't matter. The system had found its scapegoat. Prison swallowed her. Days bled into years, years into decades. 43. But the truth never died. Long-buried notes, forgotten names, evidence pointing away from Sandy clawed toward the light. Before we dive into this heartbreaking and unforgettable story, make sure to hit like and subscribe for more wrongful conviction true crime investigations. Because Sandy Hemme's fight for justice is not just history. It's unfolding right now, and every revelation brings us closer to the truth buried in plain sight. This is the story of Sandra "Sandy" Hemme. The year was 1980, and Missouri was bracing against the restless heat of early summer. Small towns and mid-sized cities carried the rhythm of ordinary American life. People worked, families gathered, and neighbors exchanged casual greetings that carried the quiet reassurance of routine. But beneath that surface, tensions often stirred in ways invisible to most. And in the city of St. Joseph, one night in June would fracture that sense of normalcy forever. The victim was Patricia Jeschke, a respected library worker. She was known for her kindness, her reliability, her quiet presence. In the library, she had become a fixture of stability, a woman who cared deeply about books, about her community, about her role in creating a haven for readers and learners. Patricia wasn't the kind of person whose name usually appeared in headlines. But in June 1980, her name would be whispered in grief, then shouted in fear. She would be remembered not for the life she lived, but for the horrific way in which it was taken from her. When Patricia was discovered brutally murdered in her home, shock rippled through the community. News of the crime spread quickly, a violent attack, a sense of violation. Neighbors who once left doors unlocked now checked them twice. Parents warned their children to come straight home after school. A woman who represented safety and familiarity had been targeted in her own sanctuary. For the people of St. Joseph, it was unthinkable. The demand for justice was immediate. Police swarmed the scene, investigators combed through the details, and within days, pressure mounted for an arrest. The public wanted answers. The family wanted closure. And law enforcement, facing community outrage and fear, wanted to deliver results quickly. But justice, as it would turn out, was not what the system was preparing to deliver. At the same time this tragedy unfolded, Sandra Hemme's life was unraveling in a different way. Sandy was a young woman in her 20s, struggling under the weight of mental illness. She was soft-spoken, often withdrawn, and had spent much of her young adulthood in and out of psychiatric hospitals. She wasn't violent. She wasn't threatening. She was fragile, vulnerable, a woman seeking stability in a world that seemed constantly tilted against her. On the night Patricia's life was taken, Sandy wasn't prowling the streets, plotting crimes, or living in shadows. She was hospitalized in a mental health institution, medicated, subdued, and far from the outside world. She wasn't a suspect. She wasn't even connected to the case. But fate, or more precisely, the failures of the justice system, was about to place her squarely in its crosshairs. Sandy had long battled the stigma surrounding mental illness. In the 1970s and early 1980s, society's understanding of psychiatric disorders was crude at best and cruel at worst. Patients were medicated heavily, their voices dismissed, their humanity often overshadowed by their diagnoses. For women like Sandy, whose vulnerability left them without strong advocates, the psychiatric system could become less a refuge and more a trap. She had dreams once, a vision of a normal life, friends, family, perhaps even a small home of her own. But those dreams had been eroded by the relentless cycle of hospitalizations and treatments that never seemed to heal. By 1980, she was adrift, dependent on others, her voice drowned out by those in positions of power. And yet, somehow, the machinery of justice would turn to her. Not because evidence pointed her way, not because she had any ties to Patricia Jeschke, but because the system, under pressure, needed someone. In the days following Patricia's murder, the police investigation seemed desperate. Detectives interviewed neighbors, friends, and anyone who might have glimpsed something unusual. But the case refused to neatly unravel. Leads dried up. Witnesses hesitated. A violent crime had been committed, and yet the trail was cold. Behind the scenes, rumors swirled. Some pointed to dangerous figures in the community, men with criminal pasts, men known for violence. In particular, whispers grew around a police informant, a man with connections to the victim. But pursuing that path would be messy. It would cast doubt not just on one man, but on the very system that relied on him. And so, when detectives heard about Sandy, a young woman in psychiatric care, heavily medicated, struggling to piece together reality, they saw something else, an opportunity. Sandy was in no position to defend herself. Her mind was clouded, her memory fragmented, her sense of time and place unreliable. And in that fragility, investigators would claim to find confessions. When police entered the hospital to question Sandy, the balance of power could not have been more uneven. On one side, seasoned detectives determined to close the case. On the other, a heavily sedated patient, unsure of what was happening around her. The interrogations blurred the line between questioning and coercion. Sandy, confused and compliant, responded to leading questions. At times, she contradicted herself. At other times, she seemed to parrot back what was suggested to her. These weren't the words of a calculating killer. They were the fragmented responses of a woman in crisis. But to the detectives, they were enough. They seized on the inconsistencies not as proof of her innocence, but as material to shape into a narrative. They framed her confusion as confession, her vulnerability as guilt. And slowly, a story was crafted. A story that positioned Sandy, a fragile woman with no history of violence, as the brutal murderer of Patricia Jeschke. It happened so quickly, it was almost invisible. One moment, Sandy was a patient. The next, she was a suspect. And once that shift occurred, everything else followed with crushing inevitability. Hospital records showing she was under heavy medication, overlooked. The lack of physical evidence tying her to the scene, ignored. The contradictions in her statements, brushed aside. The narrative was set. Sandy Hemme had killed Patricia Jeschke. The families who looked on couldn't understand. To Patricia's loved ones, the arrest provided some sense of relief, the promise of justice, even if imperfect. To Sandy's family, it was devastating. They knew her. They knew she wasn't capable of such violence. But their voices, like Sandy's, were drowned out by the machinery of accusation. What does it mean to watch your life derail in real time? To feel the ground shift beneath your feet and realize you are no longer seen as a person, but as a suspect? For Sandy, it was like being trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake from. Already battling mental illness, the added weight of accusation was crushing. The stigma doubled. She wasn't just the patient anymore. She was the murderer. And in the eyes of the system, once that label stuck, it became nearly impossible to peel away. But for Sandy, the worst was still to come. The interrogations would intensify, the accusations would harden, and soon, the case would shift from investigation to trial. A courtroom drama where truth would take a back seat to performance. And as Sandy sat, confused and frightened, she could not have imagined the scale of what lay ahead. For decades of imprisonment for a crime she did not commit. The courtroom is a theater. Every trial is a performance. The attorneys, the actors, the judge, the director, the jury, the audience. And in 1981, when Sandra "Sandy" Hemme entered the courtroom in St. Joseph, Missouri, she wasn't seen as a young woman in need of help. She was cast in a role she never chose, the villain. But behind the cold wood of the defense table, Sandy wasn't menacing. She was fragile, small. Her hands shook. Her eyes darted nervously around the room, not out of guilt, but out of fear. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of being crushed by a system too vast for her to fight. Fear of being buried alive by a story that wasn't hers. At the heart of the prosecution's case was Sandy's so-called confession. But to understand it, we must go back to where it began, inside the psychiatric hospital. Sandy was heavily medicated at the time. Records later showed she was under the influence of drugs meant to calm and sedate, not sharpen memory or clarity. When detectives arrived, they didn't find a calculating criminal. They found a vulnerable woman whose mind was fogged, whose grasp of time and reality was slipping. They asked leading questions. They fed her details. And when her responses faltered, they pressed harder. Her words, fragmented and confused, should have been dismissed as unreliable. Instead, they were treated as gospel. Every inconsistency, every contradiction, every hesitation was twisted to fit a narrative of guilt. Imagine being asked to recall events you never lived, while medicated, confused, and desperate to please authority. That was Sandy's confession, not a statement of guilt, but a cry of confusion. Yet in court, it was presented with chilling certainty. The prosecutor stood before the jury with an unwavering voice. He painted a picture of Sandy as unstable, dangerous, and unpredictable. He pointed to her mental illness not as evidence of her need for compassion, but as proof of her potential for violence. This, he said, is a woman capable of murder. No physical evidence tied Sandy to the crime scene. No fingerprints. No DNA. No eyewitness placing her at Patricia Jeschke's home. Nothing but words extracted in a hospital room, under duress and stripped of context. But the prosecution didn't need evidence. They had a story, and stories, when told with confidence, can overpower facts. To the jury, Patricia's murder was a brutal, senseless act. They wanted justice. They wanted someone to blame. And here was a young woman, fragile, mentally ill, unable to mount a convincing defense. She became the perfect target. Sandy's defense attorneys faced an uphill battle. They argued her confession was coerced, unreliable, the product of her mental state and the heavy medication she was on. They tried to shine a light on the lack of evidence, the contradictions, the gaping holes in the prosecution's story. But their words fell flat against the weight of stigma. In the early 1980s, mental illness carried a heavy burden in the courtroom. Jurors often equated psychiatric diagnoses with danger, instability, and violence. The prosecution leaned into those biases, portraying Sandy not as a human being, but as a symbol of fear. Each time the defense tried to humanize her, the prosecution dehumanized her further. Each attempt to show her vulnerability was reframed as proof of guilt. The jury wasn't just deciding guilt or innocence. They were wrestling with fear, and fear is a powerful force. Through it all, Sandy sat in silence. her voice muffled by medication and fear. She tried to speak at times, tried to assert her innocence, but her words carried little weight. To many in the courtroom, she was already guilty. Her very presence, nervous, trembling, withdrawn, seemed to confirm the narrative built around her. It was a cruel irony. The same vulnerability that made her incapable of defending herself was used as the foundation of the case against her. Her family, seated in the gallery, watched in horror. They knew Sandy wasn't capable of such violence. They knew she was being scapegoated. But their grief, their outrage, their pleas couldn't pierce the armor of a courtroom determined to deliver a conviction. When the jury finally returned, the air in the courtroom was thick with tension. Sandy sat motionless, her eyes wide, her lips pressed together as if holding back a storm of emotions she couldn't release. Guilty. The word echoed like a hammer striking steel. Sandy's head dropped, not in admission, but in devastation. For her, it was the moment her life shattered completely. The fragile hope that someone might see her, might believe her, was gone. Her family wept. Some cried out, but the gavel silenced them. Order restored. Justice, in the system's eyes, had been served. Sandy was sentenced to life in prison. What does it mean to be sentenced for a crime you didn't commit? For Sandy, it meant the erasure of her identity. Overnight, she was no longer Sandra Hemme, the young woman fighting to survive mental illness. She was inmate number redacted. Her days in the hospital, once a blur of medications and therapy, were replaced with the cold reality of prison walls. The bars didn't just cage her body, they caged her truth. Each morning, she woke to the sound of clanging metal doors. Each night, she lay in darkness, replaying the moments in court, the words twisted against her, the faces that judged her. And in between, the endless hours stretched on, years that would accumulate into decades. But perhaps the cruelest part was knowing that the real killer was still free. Patricia Jesch's family was denied true justice, and Sandy was denied her life. Looking back, the trial of Sandra "Sandy" Hemme wasn't about truth. It was about closure, the appearance of resolution, the illusion of justice. Police had delivered a suspect. Prosecutors had delivered a narrative. The jury had delivered a verdict. But truth? That was buried alongside Sandy's freedom. The cracks in the case were there from the beginning. Hospital records, contradictions, lack of evidence. But they were ignored, paved over by urgency and fear. And so, a fragile young woman, already struggling to find her place in the world, was condemned to spend her life behind bars for a crime she did not commit. Yet, even as the cell door slammed shut, even as Sandy resigned herself to a future of confinement, whispers began to stir. Questions lingered. Documents remained hidden. And somewhere, buried beneath the weight of decades, the truth waited to be uncovered. Because the story of Sandra Hemme wasn't over. Not yet. The courthouse in St. Joseph, Missouri, stood like a fortress of stone and shadow. Its steps had carried generations of men and women toward justice, or at least the illusion of it. In the summer of 1981, those steps carried Sandra "Sandy" Hemme, shackled not only by handcuffs, but by the invisible weight of voices that were not her own. She was led into the courtroom, frail, exhausted, her hair unkempt, her eyes clouded by medication that dulled her reality. This was not the image of a cold-blooded murderer. This was the image of a woman broken by years of psychiatric struggle, a woman lost in a fog of confusion and fear. And yet, inside that courtroom, none of it mattered. The state had its narrative. The police had their scapegoat. The jury would soon have its story to believe. The prosecutor painted Sandy as something more than fragile. He called her unpredictable. He suggested that beneath her pale, subdued demeanor lurked danger. a disturbed woman who had snapped and taken a life. He pointed to her confessions, cobbled together during interrogations when she was incoherent, sedated, and desperate to please the officers who loomed over her. The defense, woefully underprepared, could not counter the theatrics. They barely scratched the surface of her mental health records. They did not present the mountain of contradictions, the shifting statements, the impossibility of timelines, the absence of physical evidence. Sandy sat silent. She could barely comprehend what was unfolding. Every word spoken about her seemed to float above her, unreachable, as though she were watching a play she had not agreed to star in. The victim's family sat in grief-stricken silence. They wanted answers, closure, someone to bear the weight of their tragedy. In their eyes, Sandy, small, fragile, but conveniently accused, was the answer the system had delivered. And so, grief aligned with suspicion, and suspicion hardened into belief. But behind the spectacle, the truth was tangled in contradictions. No fingerprints of Sandy's were found at the crime scene. No witnesses placed her anywhere near the victim's home. The timeline of her supposed involvement made no sense. Her shifting confessions, recorded under the haze of antipsychotic drugs, contradicted themselves repeatedly. And yet, the jury was shown only fragments. The state built a story on half-truths, deliberately ignoring leads that pointed in another direction. Another suspect, a man with a violent history and connections to the victim, had surfaced early in the investigation. But those leads were buried, dismissed, forgotten. Why? Because the machinery of justice thrives on resolution, not truth. And Sandy, vulnerable and voiceless, was the easiest path toward a conviction. Her attorney, overwhelmed, underfunded, and perhaps indifferent, mounted little resistance. He failed to call key witnesses. He did not press the inconsistencies with the force they deserved. He never conveyed to the jury the depth of Sandy's psychiatric condition, nor the ways it rendered her so easily manipulated by authority. It was not a defense. It was a surrender, and Sandy felt it. Sitting at that table, hands folded in front of her, she felt herself slipping further into invisibility. No one heard her. No one believed her. The courtroom spoke around her, through her, but never to her. The trial moved quickly, too quickly. Within days, the jury was sent to deliberate. The question of Sandy's life, her future, her very identity as an innocent or guilty woman, rested in the hands of 12 strangers who had been shown only fragments of a broken puzzle. The deliberations did not last long. When they filed back into the courtroom, Sandy could feel her breath catch. Her body trembled, not because she understood the full gravity of what was happening, but because somewhere, deep inside, she knew the world was about to abandon her completely. The foreman stood. The words rang out, guilty. The room exhaled. The state had its victory. The victim's family had their closure. The jury had fulfilled their civic duty. And Sandy? She was swallowed whole. Prison is designed to break people. For Sandy, already fractured by mental illness, the walls pressed in like a tomb. The days bled into one another. The clang of doors, the echo of boots on concrete, the relentless routine. It all became a dull backdrop to her confusion. The medication continued. The fog deepened. She lost track of days, seasons, years. But inside that fog, a faint ember of awareness remained. She knew she did not belong there. She knew that truth had been buried. And in fleeting moments of clarity, that ember sparked into anguish, the kind of anguish that gnawed at her soul and refused to let her rest. Her family visited when they could, but each visit ended with the same heartbreaking image: Sandy being led back behind bars, her figure shrinking into the shadows. They wept for her, but they could not save her. The system had branded her, and the brand was seared into stone. Years passed, decades even. Other cases rose and fell. Other names captured headlines. But Sandy's case, the story of a vulnerable woman wrongfully convicted on the flimsiest of evidence, faded from public memory. She became invisible, a ghost wandering the halls of Missouri's prisons. Even those who worked there often forgot her story. To them, she was just another inmate. But truth has a way of lingering, even when buried. And in Sandy's case, truth was not gone, only hidden. Every so often, a crack appeared in the official story. A law student reviewing old files noticed inconsistencies. An attorney whispered about a wrongful conviction. Advocates for the mentally ill pointed to Sandy's case as an example of systemic failure. And slowly, ever so slowly, whispers of doubt began to circulate. Could it be that Sandy had been sacrificed to convenience? Could it be that the real killer had walked free while she rotted in prison? For years, these questions floated without answer. But eventually, they began to gather momentum. People started looking closer. New eyes began to peel back the layers of the case. And what they found would shake the foundation of Sandy's conviction. By the time advocates and innocence lawyers began to seriously investigate, Sandy had been imprisoned for decades. She was weary, frail, and still heavily medicated. But somewhere inside, the ember remained. And when they told her they believed her story, when they said they wanted to fight for her, that ember flared into something she had not felt in years: hope. The battle, however, would not be easy. The system that had buried the truth once before was not eager to unearth it. Records had vanished. Evidence had decayed. Witnesses had aged or passed away. But still, the fight began. And with it, the possibility that Sandy's voice, silenced for so long, might finally be heard. Sandy's imprisonment was never just about her. It was about the machinery of justice, the ease with which the vulnerable can be discarded, and the frightening truth that sometimes innocence is irrelevant in the courtroom. But as whispers grew louder, as new eyes uncovered long-buried truths, Sandy's case shifted from forgotten tragedy to a symbol of resilience. The prison yard had seen Sandra Hemme walk its cracked pavement for decades. Seasons changed, bitter Missouri winters, sweltering summers, and still, she shuffled along the same paths. Her hair grew thinner. Her face bore the marks of time and medication. For most of the world, she had become invisible, forgotten. But then, like a spark in the darkness, voices began to rise. It began with law students and innocence advocates combing through old files. They had read about Sandy in obscure reports, a woman who had confessed to a murder she could not have possibly committed, a woman with severe mental illness convicted despite glaring inconsistencies. At first, she was just a name in a stack of potential wrongful convictions. But the deeper they dug, the more they realized this case wasn't just suspicious. It was alarming. They visited Sandy in prison. She looked smaller than her years, her frame bent under invisible weight. When they told her who they were, she blinked, as if not believing. For so long, no one had come. No one had asked to hear her side of the story. And now, suddenly, these strangers sat across the plastic prison table, leaning in, saying the words she had never expected to hear again. "We believe you. We think you're innocent." The words cracked something open inside her, a mix of disbelief, fear, and the faintest trace of hope. Hope was dangerous. Hope had been ripped away from her too many times. But this felt different. The new legal team began unearthing what had been ignored or buried for decades. The files told a damning story. Shifting confessions, Sandy had given multiple versions of events, each riddled with contradictions, each shaped under the influence of heavy antipsychotic medication. None matched the physical evidence. Suppressed leads, Police had ignored a far more credible suspect, a man with a violent criminal record and clear connections to the crime scene. His name appeared in early investigation notes, then mysteriously vanished from the trial narrative. No physical evidence, not a fingerprint, not a strand of hair, not a single shred tied Sandy to the victim's home. The deeper they dug, the more the truth screamed from the files. Sandy had not been convicted on facts. She had been convicted on fear, convenience, and the desperation of a system that needed someone, anyone, to blame. For Sandy, the process was excruciating. Her attorneys filed motions, drafted appeals, and argued before judges, but months turned into years. The system moved at a glacial pace, indifferent to the urgency of a woman's stolen life. Each hearing carried a cruel rhythm: shackles, transport vans, fluorescent-lit rooms, and then a return to the cell that had become her world. Each time, she wondered, will today be the day they listen? The hope her advocates had sparked was fragile. Too much had been taken already. Every denial, every delay chipped at her, threatening to collapse the fragile scaffolding of belief that maybe, just maybe, she could walk free again. Her family, aging parents, distant siblings, nieces and nephews she barely knew, carried their own grief. They had fought for her in the early years, but the system had worn them down. Decades passed, and with them, the bitter acceptance that Sandy might never come home. Now, as Innocence advocates reignited the fight, her family dared to hope again. But hope after so much time was dangerous for them, too. They had learned to protect themselves from disappointment. Still, they sat in courtrooms when they could, their faces etched with silent pleas. The town of St. Joseph had long since moved on. The murder of a librarian that once shook the community had faded into memory. Many who had whispered about the case in 1980 were now gone, replaced by a younger generation who barely knew the name Sandra Hemme. But as Innocence organizations began to shine light on her story, whispers returned. Articles were written. Reporters asked questions. The case that had once been forgotten was back in the public's eye, and this time, the narrative was different. No longer the dangerous woman prosecutors had painted, Sandy was now seen as a fragile victim of the system. Decades of wrongful imprisonment had carved deep scars into Sandy's mind. Years of forced medication left her disoriented. She often struggled to follow legal updates, her memory fragmented by the passage of time. But there were moments, rare, fleeting moments, when clarity broke through. In those moments, she spoke with heartbreaking lucidity. "I didn't do it," she would whisper to her lawyers, tears streaking her face. "I never did it." Each time, they reassured her, "We know, and we're going to prove it." The breakthrough came when Innocence lawyers uncovered hidden police notes. Notes that pointed directly to the alternate suspect, a man with a violent past, a man who had actually been seen near the victim's home. His name had been erased from trial records, but here, in faded ink, was proof police had known. They had chosen to ignore it. The discovery shifted everything. It was no longer just about Sandy's innocence. It was about misconduct, about a justice system that had actively buried the truth. Armed with this evidence, her lawyers prepared for the fight of their lives. By now, Sandy had spent more than 40 years behind bars. Entire lifetimes had passed her by. Children had grown into adults. Adults had become elders. The world outside had transformed. Cell phones, the internet, new skylines, while she remained trapped in the same concrete walls. Her lawyers argued before the court with urgency. Sandy Hemme was innocent. The state had stolen 4 decades from her. The conviction had been built on sand, and it was time, long past time, to set her free. Inside the courtroom, Sandy sat quietly, hands folded, eyes lowered. She looked fragile, Almost ghostly, her presence a haunting reminder of what wrongful conviction does to a human being. The prosecutors pushed back. They argued finality, procedure, the difficulty of retrying a decades-old case. But beneath their legal maneuvers was a quiet truth they could not hide. The case against Sandy had crumbled. News outlets seized on the story. Headlines called Sandy America's longest-serving wrongfully convicted woman. Documentaries and podcasts began circling her case. Social media amplified her plight, turning her name into a rallying cry for justice reform. The public was no longer silent. Pressure mounted on the courts, on prosecutors, on the state of Missouri itself. How could they justify keeping a broken, innocent woman behind bars when the truth was so clear? For Sandy, the hearings were unbearable. Every time she was led in shackles before a judge, she wondered if this would be the last time. She wondered if she would step back into the sunlight as a free woman or be returned once again to the shadows. Her lawyers, family, and supporters waited with bated breath. The weight of decades hung in the balance. And as the judge listened to the evidence, the hidden notes, the unreliable confessions, the suppressed suspect, the silence in the courtroom became suffocating. Would the system finally admit its mistake? The courtroom air was heavy, the kind of silence that presses down on the chest and makes every breath feel deliberate. At the defense table sat Sandra "Sandy" Hemme, shackled, shoulders hunched, eyes downcast. She had been in that position for nearly 44 years, a lifetime stolen, a life erased. But this day felt different. When her lawyers uncovered the long-buried police notes pointing to another man, a violent suspect dismissed decades ago, it cracked the case wide open. No longer could prosecutors rely on the shaky foundation of coerced confessions. The record now showed not only Sandy's innocence, but the system's choice to ignore the truth. For weeks leading up to the hearing, Sandy's lawyers worked without rest, filing motions, piecing together the broken timeline, reconstructing the case the way it should have been told in 1980. Their argument was clear: Sandy was never guilty. The state knew it, and she deserved her freedom. Now? Inside chambers, whispers circulated. Judges knew this wasn't just another appeal. This was a reckoning. If the conviction crumbled, it wouldn't just exonerate Sandy. It would expose an entire system of negligence, misconduct, and cruelty. When Sandy was escorted into the courtroom that morning, reporters filled the benches. Cameras outside the courthouse broadcast her case across the nation. For the first time in decades, Sandy's name wasn't whispered in forgotten corners. It was shouted from headlines. The longest wrongfully incarcerated woman in America? 44 years lost. Missouri's Hemme case under fire. The people watching saw more than a defendant. They saw a woman whose youth, dreams, and dignity had been consumed by concrete walls. They saw a survivor of a justice system that chewed her up and spat her out. And in the gallery sat her family, grayer, older, but still present. A sister wiped tears with a trembling hand. A nephew she had never truly known leaned forward, eyes locked on the woman who should have watched him grow. The state, cornered by evidence, played its last card, finality. They argued that too much time had passed, that retrying or reopening the case was impossible. Witnesses were gone. Memories faded. Files misplaced. They framed the appeal not as justice delayed, but as a burden on the system. It was a chilling reminder of how the machinery of justice often values its own convenience above human lives. For Sandy, it was salt in the wound. She had lost 44 years, and now the state dared to claim it was too late to fix their mistake. But the judge listened, and as the evidence stacked against the prosecution, the old arguments of finality rang hollow. What mattered now was truth. In the middle of testimony, something extraordinary happened. Sandy, who had sat silent for so long, lifted her head. Her voice, raspy from years of silence, broke through the courtroom. "I didn't do it," she whispered. The room froze. Every eye turned toward her. For years, those words had been drowned by forced medication, by interrogators twisting her statements, by prosecutors painting her as a liar. But now, with her advocates beside her and the truth laid bare, her voice carried a weight it never had before. And for the first time, people listened. When the gavel finally struck, the words felt surreal. The conviction was vacated. Sandy Hemme, once branded a murderer, once erased by history, was declared innocent. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Her sister wept openly. Her lawyers embraced. Even seasoned reporters admitted to blinking back tears. But for Sandy, the moment was disorienting. Freedom, after so long, felt like an idea she couldn't hold. Her body trembled, her breath uneven. She had prayed for this moment for decades, but now that it had arrived, it felt almost impossible to believe. The prison gates clanged open, and Sandy stepped into the sunlight. The air was warm against her face. The sky, vast and open, seemed too big after decades of caged ceilings. She squinted, shielding her eyes, as if the world itself was too bright to face. Supporters clapped. Cameras flashed. But for Sandy, the moment was quiet. Her first steps outside weren't triumphant strides. They were hesitant, trembling, uncertain. A woman who had entered prison as a young adult now emerged an elderly survivor. She looked around as if the earth itself had shifted. Cars were sleeker, streets busier, the world unrecognizable. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "I don't know how to be free." Exoneration does not erase the years lost. It cannot give back birthdays, holidays, or the simple joy of waking up without chains. Sandy's body bore the toll, her health fragile, her mind scarred from years of overmedication. She faced a strange paradox. She was free, yet she had to rebuild a life she had never truly lived. For her family, freedom brought joy mixed with grief. They celebrated her release, but they also mourned the decades stolen. A niece whispered, "I should have grown up with her. We should have had a life together." The world moved on, but Sandy had not. She carried prison in her bones. And though the law declared her innocent, she remained haunted by a question that would never fully leave. Why me? Why did they choose me? Sandy Hemme's case is now more than her story. It is a warning, a symbol, a mirror held up to a justice system that too often chooses expediency over truth, silence over accountability, and human sacrifice over justice. Her name joins the growing list of exonerated, lives stolen, freedom delayed, voices silenced until it was almost too late. But her story is also a call to listen, to fight, to refuse the easy lies that condemn the innocent. Sandra Hemme walked out of prison after more than 4 decades wrongfully convicted, America's longest-serving wrongfully incarcerated woman. But freedom cannot undo what was taken. It cannot restore the years, the family, the moments lost in shadows. Her story is not just about one woman. It is about every man and woman still trapped in the gears of a system that can, and does, fail. Before we close, I want to say this. These stories matter. They reveal the hidden cracks in the foundation of justice. Cracks that can swallow whole lives if we are not vigilant. Back-end index pointing right if you believe Sandy Hemme's story deserves to be heard. If you believe no one should endure what she did. Make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it so her voice echoes far beyond this courtroom. Because Sandy's fight is not just her own. It is the fight of every wrongfully convicted person still waiting, still hoping, still praying for justice. This is not just the story of Sandra Hemme. This is the story of a broken system, and the question that lingers for us all: how many more Sandys are still behind bars?